G'day, I'm Adam Collings. Welcome to Stories. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to take you on a bit of a bookshelf tour. Back in my university days and into my early career, I read a lot of Star Trek books. This was in the late 90s and early 2000s, what I tend to consider the golden age of Star Trek books. So I thought it'd be fun to go have a look at some of the books I read during that time and which ones were my favourites. So, let's head on out to the Batcave. Well, welcome to the Batcave. Let's start with the Deep Space Nine relaunch. When the TV series ended, Pocket Books decided to continue the story with books. This is how it all started. Avatar books 1 and 2. This is pretty much the season pilot for season 8. This was a really interesting idea, and I thought it was very successful. I was very excited about this relaunch, and I just gobbled these books up like nothing else. I read a lot more of the Deep Space Nine relaunch. I borrowed a lot of the books. I went all the way through to Unity, which was like the end of season 8, and it continued beyond that as well. Star Trek Federation. This was a brilliant book. This may have been my favourite Star Trek novel. This has several stories going at once. At the beginning, there's an original series story, there's a Next Generation story, and there's a prequel story about Zefram Cochrane, the inventor of the warp drive. Now this part actually borrows a lot of some of the interesting stuff set up by Encounter at Farpoint, which was the Next Generation pilot episode. A lot of this is probably overridden by the movie First Contact, but that's just how it goes with Star Trek books. The three stories all converged together, and it just ended up being a really enjoyable crossover with a lot of interesting stuff going on in there. So, if you ever read a Star Trek book, read this one. Q Squared was an interesting read. This had a lot of alternate timeline stuff going on, and it brought back the character of Trelane from the original series and portrayed him as a member of the Q Continuum, which I thought was a nice touch. Got a bunch of Dominion War books here. There's two parts to this. There's the Deep Space Nine side, which was just a retelling of the first 6 episodes of Season 6. The more interesting part was the Next Generation side. Now, the premise of this is, what were the crew of the Enterprise doing during those early days of the Dominion War? And that's the part that really excited me. This was interesting, but I felt it didn't fulfill its premise quite as well as it could have done, given that Picard went off on this undercover mission, and it took him away from the Enterprise. It was all interesting, but it just didn't quite fit my expectations. Another Dominion War book that came along later was The Battle for Beta Z. This was a Next Generation novel. If you remember, Beta Z, which is Deanna Troy's home planet, was captured by the Dominion in the late days of the war. So this is a little standalone book, just telling the story of Dominion occupation on Beta Z. This was an interesting one, Dark Mirror. This was basically a Next Generation era story set in the Mirror universe, which of course was introduced in the original series. Quite enjoyed First Frontier. This was a time travel story. Kirk and crew used the Guardian of Forever, an old favourite of mine, to travel back to Earth's early past. So we've got Star Trek and dinosaurs. How could you go wrong with a combination like that? Okay, now we come to what I thought was a really interesting series, The Captain's Table. The idea here is that there's this bar travelling through space and time with entry points all over the galaxy, different points in history, and it's a place where captains of starships can go and meet together and basically tell stories to each other. Here was the first one, Captain Pike's story. Now, you don't often get a lot of Captain Pike in the Star Trek books, and I really enjoyed this one. Not just because it brought some of the characters back from the original Star Trek pilot The Cage, but because it was just a really good science fiction story. It had these space whales, which were basically used as starships by our race, and it was a fascinating idea. I loved it. There was also a New Frontier episode. This, I believe, provided some interesting backstory into Captain Calhoun's character. There was a Janeway story, Deep Space Nine story, Next Generation, and a combined Kirk and Sulu book. I quite enjoyed the Deep Space Nine book because it really delved into what it meant to have this bar travelling through space and time, whereas a lot of the other books just ignored it, used it purely as a framing device, and didn't explore that concept at all. Now I have to mention the Eugenics Wars book, The Rise and Fall of Khan Noonien Singh. Wow, what a fascinating book this was. We all remember how the original series portrayed the idea that Khan had risen to power in the 90s and tried to take over the world, and that's when the Eugenics Wars happened. I don't remember that happening in the 90s. Now, this book was basically an attempt to explain all of that. So it takes a lot of real-world historical events from the 80s and 90s, and yeah, it just reinterprets them and adds a little bit of sci-fi. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the tour of my Star Trek book collection. If you'd like to connect with me, you can go to collingzone.wordpress.com and click on the About page. There's a whole lot of different ways that you can connect with me. And I'll see you next time. Catch you later.